All right, by 11, here we are with kingdom Animalia, which is part of domain Eukarya. Just some reminders around taxonomy and naming. Hopefully you know that all living things can be divided up into taxa, or groups, on the basis of shared characteristics and common evolutionary history. We've already covered a couple kingdoms and domains. Remember, those are the largest groups that we can divide our life up into. And we're going to move our way down, covering a few phyla from the animal kingdom, and eventually start talking about individual species, the narrowest taxa containing just a single member. It's important to remember this hierarchy or the order of these different groups, and a mnemonic is a good way to help you to remember. When I was in school, I learned Do Kids Play Catch over Farmer Grimm's Stable to help me remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But there's lots of other mnemonics out there, a couple here on the screen, and if you go to this website, there's a whole list of options to help you remember. Some of them school appropriate, some of them less so, but hey, you're at home, so go crazy. Here are the domains and kingdoms we'll be covering in Bi 11. We've already covered off the two prokaryotic domains, bacteria or eubacteria and archaea, which are also the names of those two kingdoms. Over here in domain Eukarya, we've talked about protists already, and now we're jumping in here to animals, kingdom Animalia. When we're talking about an individual organism, there is a naming system that was developed by Carl Linnaeus, and it's called binomial nomenclature. Binomial just means two names, and nomenclature means naming system. You are probably familiar with this already. You've heard Homo sapiens or Tyrannosaurus rex, and those are binomial names. They are named giving the genus, Tyrannosaurus or Homo, and the species, sapiens or rex. When we're writing them down, we capitalize the genus name only, so capital T for Tyrannosaurus, and we leave the species name, Rex, as lowercase. If you are typing, underlined or italics, and if you're handwriting, an underline will do well. There's lots of funny examples out there, a couple lists down here, and even a game to help you see if you can figure out a few of them. And again, a couple videos are going to be linked throughout this presentation, so feel free to open up the slideshow and watch those videos for yourself. A couple examples here for fun. This one here is the jelly bean beetle. There's also a jelly belly, a jelly donut, a jellyfish, and a jelly roll. So in that case, the genus jelly describes a group of fungus beetles, and the scientists have been a little bit creative with their species names: bean, belly, donut, fish, and roll. Sometimes a species name is a little more informative than funny. Here is Haliaeetus leucocephalus, which is the bald eagle. Haliaeetus is the Greek for salt, and eagle, or sea eagle, and leuco, we've seen that before and we'll see it again, means white or light, and cephalus means head. So this translates to a white-headed sea eagle. Sometimes scientists use inspiration from what they look like and pop culture. So this one here, Eriovixia gryffindorii, is named after the sorting hat from Harry Potter. And one of my favorites, Ophiuchthus, although not easy to say, adorabilis, is this cute little octopus, which its name is still under review, but I think it's very suiting for that cute little guy. All right, into the animals. Now, all members of kingdom Animalia have several characteristics in common. They're from domain Eukarya, so they of course are all eukaryotic, which means they're made from cells that contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Unlike the animal-like protists, true animals are all multicellular, so they're made of many cells that work together. They are also all heterotrophic, which means they need to eat their food in order to get energy. Animals are motile. At some stage in their life, they're able to move around, and most animals reproduce sexually. Some of them reproduce asexually only, and many are able to do both sexual and asexual reproduction. When we're talking about animals, we group them into taxa on the basis of their similar characteristics. And a lot of evolutionary patterns are obvious when we start to look at these groupings. And the characteristics that we're going to use to talk about this classification is tissue organization, symmetry, gastrulation, and body cavities. So it's important that you understand these four categories, because this is how we're going to base the classification of all the further phyla from kingdom Animalia. First is tissue organization. And when we talk about tissue, we're describing a group of similar cells from the same developmental origin that work together to carry out a specific function. In complex organisms, tissues group together and function together to form organs, and organs can work together to form a system. So an example from the human body, well, you have a specialized muscle cell. Many muscle cells working together make a muscle or muscle tissue. And muscle tissue groups together with other types of tissues to make an organ. For example, your heart, which uses muscle tissue to pump, a form of connective tissue, which is your blood, to circulate oxygen throughout the body. All of that is part of your circulatory system, which works in conjunction with lungs and blood vessels and capillary beds in all sorts of places in the body to do the functions of circulating oxygen and nutrients around the body. And that is just one of the systems that makes up an entire organism of the human body. So tissues, when we're looking at this from a categorization or classification standpoint, we're looking at the number of tissue layers, whether or not there are indeed true tissues or just specialized cells grouped together. And we're looking at the complexity of those tissues. Are they forming true organs and organ systems, or are they just working as sort of specialized cells grouped together? The second classification category is symmetry. And organisms may exhibit a variety of different forms of symmetry, the simplest being asymmetry, meaning they are not symmetrical or have no planes where they can be divided up and have equal sides or halves. Radial symmetry, something like a starfish or a sea anemone or a jellyfish, this would be something like dividing up a pie where you can slice it in lots of different directions and end up with equal halves no matter which way you slice it. And then the more complex organisms have bilateral symmetry. And this is the type of symmetry that you and I display. There is only one way that we can divide ourselves up into two equal halves, and that would be straight down the middle, connecting a line, nose and belly button, and divide you into your two halves, left and right. It's important to note here too some of the anatomical terms we'll be using. Anterior and posterior describe direction that is towards the head end and towards the tail end or back end. And then dorsal and ventral describes the back, which for us would be our spine, and ventral means the belly side. So those are some of the anatomical directions we'll be looking at. Gastrulation describes the process of how an individual single-celled zygote divides and forms into a multicellular organism. First stages of development, as the zygote starts to multiply the number of cells, eventually we end up to this blastula, which is a hollow ball of cells. You can see here there's an internal cavity called a blastocele. And then at some point in the development of that tiny little embryo, gastrulation occurs. And gastrulation is this inward folding of some of the cells to make an inside layer and an outside layer. You can see here the outer layer is colored in blue and the inner layer is colored in yellow. That opening that opens to that internal cavity is called a blastopore. And depending on what that opening eventually becomes, we can categorize this organism as either being a protostome or a deuterostome. Stome means mouth. Proto means first. So a protostome would be an organism who forms mouth first. Some of those organisms never actually end up forming an anus, and their mouth is both the opening to the digestive cavity and the exit. Deuterostome would be mouth second, and so the anus forms first from that blastopore. This is a category that we fall into, as well as the echinoderms. So starfish and chordates are deuterostomes, and all other animals are protostome. So we're categorizing on the basis of what forms first, mouth first or anus first. If it's anus first, a mouth always does follow. If it's mouth first, sometimes it just stays a mouth, sometimes a mouth, and then an anus develops later. So here's another diagram showing that. You can also see the development of some of these tissue layers. We have this inner layer here and the outer layer, and then eventually for some more complex organisms, a third layer, this middle layer, starts to form. And we use the word endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm to describe those layers. Here with the gastrulation, a protostome is going to form mouth first, and a deuterostome is going to form anus first, mouth comes later. And our final category for classification are the body cavities. Now, a body cavity describes a fluid-filled space in between the outer layer and the inner layer. And so the outer covering or outer layer, we call it the ectoderm, and the inner layer, the lining of the gut cavity, is called the endoderm. And there's a space between there that can be filled with fluid. There are simple organisms that just don't have that space. Their layers are packed close together and there is no filled space in between them. A pseudocoelomate has a fluid-filled cavity. Pseudo means false, but it's only partially lined by that middle layer, the mesoderm. And a coelomate would be an organism that has that fluid-filled internal space between their ectoderm and endoderm, but on both sides of that filled space is mesoderm. So it's a fully lined, fluid-filled space. Here it is in visual representation. So starting at the bottom here with our acoelomate, and a good example of this would be our flatworms. You can see that this organism does have all three tissue types or tissue layers, an endoderm, an ectoderm, and a mesoderm, but they're packed close together. There is still an internal digestive tube or tract, but the cavity we're referring to would exist out here. And in this case, it just is not there. Acoelomate means without a coelom. Moving up here to this middle diagram, we're looking at a pseudocoelomate. So here is our digestive tube again. Right? For us, that could be our mouth to anus, stomach, intestines, that tube where food passes into our body and then waste passes out. And lined here with endoderm. This empty white space represents that pseudocoelom. It would be filled with fluid, but you can see that there is this red mesoderm layer only on one side of it. And then our outer layer here is the ectoderm. So 3 tissue layers in all 3 of these examples, but it's this fluid-filled space that we use to describe its body cavity or the presence of a true coelom. Up here with the earthworm, we can see again there's that digestive tube where food would pass through the middle. That's not the body cavity we're referring to. It's this one out here, this empty space that exists between the tube of your guts and the outer body wall. So we've got ectoderm, mesoderm, empty space, another mesoderm layer, and then endoderm. We'll come back to these ideas of body cavities, especially when we get into the worms, which is where these examples are most evident. Here's another example. This one's right from the textbook, showing, again, the different organization of the tissues. And for your reference, here are some more anatomical terms. We mentioned already anterior, posterior, ventral, and dorsal, but there's lots of other terms as well. Right? Superior and inferior are a pair of terms meaning higher and lower. Cephalic and caudal mean towards the head and towards the tail. Medial and lateral means toward the middle or towards the outside or away from the middle. And proximal and distal, closer and further away. Superficial and deep, mean close to the surface of the body or deeper within the body. If you're a fan of medical shows, listen for these terms. You will hear them quite often, and we'll also use them a lot as we go through some of our virtual dissections to describe the location of different structures in the anatomy of our animals. All right, it's the end of this slideshow, and next up, we'll be jumping into our first phyla of animals, which are the sponges from phylum Porifera.